From the beginning of the Nazi regime, the mistreatment of Jews was neither incidental nor limited to an isolated group. It was integrated from the first moment as part of the functioning of the state apparatus. In the camps, orders were not intended to sanction behaviors, but to break identities. The aggressions were not a consequence of disorder, but the product of structured decisions. The body, mind, and environment of the prisoner were transformed into a permanent target of planned punishments. Over time, the actions multiplied, methods were expanded, punishments were systematized, control over every aspect of life was expanded. The victims had no escape or defense. They were only led step by a system whose objective was to destroy them completely. What mechanisms allowed these tortures to remain active for so many years without interruptions or internal fissures? In 1933, shortly after Hitler came to power, the first concentration camps under SS control began to operate. Although initially improvised and poorly organized, from the beginning they showed a pattern of systematic abuse. The first prisoners were mostly communists, political opponents, and later Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and others considered undesirable by the regime were added. Dachau was the first formal camp, and very quickly it became a model for the others. There, brutal punishments were applied, such as public beatings, prolonged confinements in dark cells, and forced labor without rest. From the first moment, the system operated with a logic of calculated terror. The objective was not only to punish, but to psychologically break the prisoners. The tortures sought to turn the inmates into obedient bodies. A frequently used method was total isolation in the bunker, a cell without light, without human contact, and without information from the outside. Many prisoners lost their minds after a few days. Others were pushed to suicide. These were not spontaneous deaths, but provoked by extreme conditions, constant threats, and emotional blackmail. Some guards even prepared the scene to simulate that the prisoner had taken his own life. The Jews, although not initially the majority in the concentration camps, already faced marked hostility. They were assigned the most exhausting tasks, their food was further reduced, and they were assaulted more frequently. Discrimination within the punishment system itself was visible from the early years. In many cases, the beatings were given in front of other prisoners as a warning. There was no limit. Some were beaten until unconscious and then forced to stand up to continue receiving punishment. Others were tied in stress positions for hours. Physical violence was mixed with public affronts, such as shaving the entire body, wearing distinctive clothing, or being forced to perform humiliating actions. There were no defined protocols. Arbitrariness was part of the system. A simple misinterpretation could end in a severe punishment. The SS guards had complete freedom to act, and many became experts in inflicting pain without leaving visible traces. The so-called punishment chambers were enclosed spaces where prolonged tortures were practiced. There, the prisoners were hung by their arms tied behind their backs, a position that dislocated the shoulders and caused unbearable pain. Some did not survive. Others were left with permanent sequelae. Control tests were also practiced. In some camps, it was measured how long a prisoner could resist standing without moving. If he fell, he was kicked until he passed out. The punishments were also collective. If someone tried to escape or a tool was lost, an entire group received the punishment. That could mean standing all night under the rain, crawling over sharp gravel, or digging meaningless ditches. The cruelty was not improvised. It was part of the system. The guards were trained to maintain constant pressure on the prisoners. With the passage of time, the camps adapted. Larger barracks were built, electrified fences were installed, and surveillance mechanisms were improved. But the forms of torture were also perfected. Surprise inspections were common. The prisoners were forced to strip their beds, line up, and endure violent searches. If something was not perfect, they received blows. The food was insufficient and often cut as a form of punishment. In the winters, the inmates were left without shelter as a form of weakening. Forced labor was a central part of the system. The goal was not only to exploit the prisoners, but to use them as an example of punishment. Jews were assigned the most dangerous tasks: quarries, construction, latrine cleaning, body transport. Extreme physical exhaustion was considered part of the punishment. If someone collapsed from weakness, they were beaten by the capos themselves or finished off. The capos were prisoners with hierarchy who acted as SS helpers. Many were just as cruel or more so, because they knew their position depended on their brutality. In the reports of the time, the SS registered punishments as disciplinary measures. Beatings, suspensions, confinements, and food deprivation were noted as part of the internal order, but the reality was a mechanism of constant torture. Some prisoners spent weeks without human contact, only receiving water through a crack. Others were used for resistance experiments. They were forced to carry stones until they collapsed, or to stand under the sun for hours without moving. The objective was to dehumanize, to destroy the will. As the beginning of the war approached, the concentration camp system spread throughout Germany and annexed areas. The Jewish population began to be arrested more frequently, and many camps filled with people whose only crime was their origin. At that stage, tortures became more frequent and more cruel. Executions as a form of punishment began to be applied in some camps. Prisoners were taken to the courtyard and shot in front of everyone. Sometimes other inmates were forced to carry the bodies or dig the graves. The official reports tried to maintain an appearance of legality, but within the system everything was opaque. There were no external controls, and the guards acted without fear of sanctions. If someone died from beatings, it was recorded as suicide or natural death. Families received cold telegrams without explanations. Total impunity allowed the tortures to increase. Each camp had its own variants, but all shared the principle of breaking the individual. In many cases, the Jews were used as targets for training. New guards practiced blows, inspections, searches, and formations with them. If someone responded with a look, that was enough to receive a punishment session. It was forbidden to speak, look, or ask for explanations. Silence and submission were mandatory. In some barracks, written rules detailing how to behave were hung. But any action was grounds for sanctions. Fear was permanent. Before the beginning of total war, the torture system was already consolidated. There was no need for a formal reason. It was enough for a guard to decide it. Every day was a constant threat for the detained Jews. There was no escape, no protection, and no witnesses. What happened inside the camps remained buried under silence and walls. Torture became routine, a tool of control and an essential part of the concentration camp system. With the outbreak of the war in September of 1939, the concentration camp system entered a new phase. The invasion of Poland caused a wave of mass arrests, and the camps quickly began to fill. The number of Jewish prisoners increased dramatically. It was no longer just about political opponents or those considered antisocial. Now, belonging to the Jewish people was sufficient reason to be arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Conditions within the camps became more brutal and organized at the same time. The goal was to exploit prisoners to the fullest, while simultaneously breaking them with constant punishments. At this stage, punishments became more frequent and structured. Beatings were public and often scheduled. There were lists of inmates who were to be punished every day. In some camps, torture shifts were established, where prisoners were forced to pass through areas where they were beaten by several guards. Stress positions became a common technique, forcing the prisoner to maintain a physically painful posture for hours under surveillance, with no possibility of movement. Food was rationed as a form of punishment. If a prisoner committed a minimal offense, their ration was reduced to the point of collapse. In some cases, Jews received no food for days. Hunger became an instrument of control. Along with hunger, exposure to extreme cold or heat was used as a form of debilitation. In winter, prisoners were forced to remain naked in the courtyard or to submerge their hands in icy water for hours. The cleaning of the barracks was another excuse to apply tortures. If the space was not in perfect condition, the entire group was punished. Senseless, repetitive cleaning was imposed, such as scrubbing the floor with toothbrushes or smoothing the earth with spoons. These exhausting and endless tasks were used to humiliate and wear down. Sometimes Jews were forced to build walls or dig trenches that they then had to fill back in. There was no practical objective, only to destroy the will. Forced labor became more intense. Prisoners were sent to quarries, mines, or road construction. Many died crushed, exhausted, or under the blow of a guard. If someone collapsed from exhaustion, they were attacked by the kapos or directly eliminated. The kapos maintained constant pressure. There was a chain of terror. The SS pressured the kapos, and they unleashed their brutality on the prisoners. The Jews were at the base of that chain and suffered the worst. Punishment cells were also used, where prisoners were locked up without light, without food, and without contact for several days. Some cells were so small that they did not allow standing or lying down. The prisoner spent the time huddled, breathing stale air. Others were locked in metal boxes in the sun, causing rapid dehydration. In some camps, a resistance test was performed. Prisoners were forced to carry enormous stones on their backs for hours without rest. Collective punishments also multiplied. If someone escaped or committed an offense, the entire group was punished. Sometimes this meant standing all night, running in circles until collapsing, or witnessing executions. The presence of corpses was part of the daily landscape. The bodies of the dead were exposed as a warning. Prisoners were forced to see, smell, and live with constant death. The psychological violence complemented the physical. There were surprise inspections at midnight, constant shouting, threats of execution, and mock executions. Some guards placed unloaded weapons to the prisoners' temples and pulled the trigger just to see their reactions. Others organized games where the prisoners were forced to fight each other, knowing that whoever lost would be punished or eliminated. The Jews continued to be the preferred target. They were assigned the most humiliating tasks, such as collecting excrement with their hands, cleaning the floors with their tongues, or carrying impossible loads. They were forbidden to talk among themselves, sing, pray, or even look at the sky. Cultural and spiritual isolation was part of the punishment. The destruction of the soul went hand in hand with that of the body. Formal executions also increased. Sometimes they were for real reasons, other times out of caprice. In some camps, special walls were built for firing squads. The prisoners were lined up and forced to witness each shot. Exemplary hangings were also applied. The bodies were left hanging for days. If someone lowered their gaze during the punishment, they were also beaten. The idea was to make it clear that life had no value. In parallel, some camps began to collaborate with the Nazi intelligence services. Jewish prisoners were interrogated under torture to obtain information about resistance networks or the whereabouts of family members. The torture sessions included blows with metal rods, cigarette burns, and minor mutilations. They were not looking for real information, but for punishment and submission. The transport to the camps was also a form of torture. The Jews were loaded into cattle cars, without water or ventilation, for days. Many died on the journey. Upon arrival, the survivors were beaten and immediately separated. Families divided, children separated, elderly discarded. Those who remained were introduced into a system of endless punishment. In this period, new camps were built and existing ones were expanded. The concentration camp system became more efficient in its cruelty. The routines were designed to wear down the prisoner without killing him completely, although many died in the process. Punishment calendars were used where a different form was applied each day. Beatings, hunger, isolation, extreme labor, humiliations. There was no rest. The SS guards were trained in torture techniques. They were taught to hit without leaving visible marks, to cause maximum pain with minimum effort. New officers practiced with real prisoners. Some camps used the most debilitated Jews as instruction material. No one questioned these acts. The hierarchy protected those responsible and fostered competition among the most cruel. There were documented cases where dogs trained to attack prisoners were used. The animals were unleashed on inmates without warning. The bites were directed at sensitive areas. Screams were ignored. If the prisoner survived, they were left with permanent injuries. If they died, they were removed and replaced. Life in the camps during these years was a combination of hunger, cold, beatings, and constant fear. There was no way to avoid punishment. The simple fact of existing as a Jew was enough to be tortured. The system did not seek to rehabilitate or punish for specific actions. Its goal was to completely destroy those it considered racial enemies. At that stage, tortures ceased to be isolated punishments and became the daily basis of the camp's operation. For Jewish prisoners, each day was a direct threat. There was no limit. There was no protection. No one intervened. What began as a detention system transformed into a machine of constant torment, and this was only the prelude to what was to come. Between 1942 and 1944, the concentration camp system entered its most extreme phase. Auschwitz became the main center of extermination, where tortures were no longer just tools of control, but part of an industrialized method of human destruction. From the moment Jews got off the trains, the process was designed to eliminate identity, strength, and life. The selection on the platform separated those who could work from those who would be killed immediately. There were no explanations, only quick gestures from the SS officers. Those who were considered fit entered a routine of continuous punishment. The rest were sent directly to the gas chambers. Tortures began at the first contact. Screams, blows, violent separations. Clothes were forcibly removed, hair was shaved, and numbers were tattooed on their arms. From then on, they were no longer people. They were pieces of the system. The mistreatment was constant: pushes, slaps, collective punishments. The goal was to reduce psychological resistance as soon as possible. The assigned jobs were not for production, but to exhaust. Jews were sent to impossible tasks, such as carrying train rails, digging ditches in frozen ground, or transporting stones for hours. The rigid time control involved forming lines in the rain or snow, without moving, for hours, just to wait for the order to begin. If someone moved or stumbled, they received a beating. If someone fell, they were beaten or finished off. Production was secondary. The core was discipline based on suffering. The punishments became increasingly sophisticated. In Auschwitz, systematic forms of torture were used, such as the post, hanging a prisoner by their arms tied behind their back, causing dislocations and partial asphyxia. This punishment could last hours. Other methods included forcing prisoners to carry their dead companions, to clean latrine waste with their bare hands, or to remain submerged up to the neck in icy pits. During this stage, medical experiments intensified. Jewish prisoners were used as guinea pigs without their consent. Viruses were injected, amputations were performed without anesthesia, and toxic drugs were tested. Forced sterilizations, genital mutilations, and pain resistance tests were also carried out. Some of these procedures were recorded or photographed. Inmates used in these trials usually died or were left with irreversible sequelae. Jewish women also suffered specific forms of torture. Many were forced to undress in front of the guards, to be invasively and humiliatingly inspected. Some were subjected to gynecological experiments, others to forced labor incompatible with their physique. Pregnant women were beaten until they aborted or were directly sent to the gas chambers. Mothers were separated from their children without explanation. Anguish was added to corporal punishment. Hunger was part of the system. Rations were so scarce that they barely sustained the body. The food consisted of a cloudy liquid in the morning, a piece of bread in the afternoon, and some stale soup at night. Prisoners weakened in a matter of days. Diseases spread quickly: dysentery, typhus, open infections. Jews received no medical attention. They were left to die or were eliminated when they could no longer walk. Internal selections were repeated every week. Officers of the SS walked through the barracks to choose those who seemed weak. Without questions, they separated them and sent them to death. Sometimes it was pretended that they were going to receive attention, but everyone knew the final destination. This constant threat generated a state of chronic fear. Some prisoners tried to appear healthy at all costs. Others preferred to surrender, exhausted by the suffering. Punishments required no justification. If a Jewish prisoner spoke out of place, if they responded slowly, or if they spilled water, they received a session of blows. The guards used sticks, rifle butts, or simply their boots. Some had personal routines of cruelty. They made the prisoners squat and stand up hundreds of times in a row, or run in circles while being beaten. The goal was not to punish errors, but to maintain fear and absolute obedience. The barracks were uninhabitable. Dozens of people shared spaces designed for half. There were no mattresses, only wooden planks. Plagues were constant. There was no possible hygiene. Many prisoners slept on the remains of others who had already died. The smell was unbearable. Tears, screams, and desperation were part of the daily environment. No one entered or left that space without carrying a physical or mental mark. Outside, the crematoria functioned without pause. The smoke and the smell of burning flesh were felt throughout the compound. Many prisoners were forced to work in the Sonderkommando, Jews forced to manipulate bodies, extract teeth, cut hair, and clean the chambers. They were replaced periodically to avoid leaving witnesses. That task was a torture in itself, not only physically but emotionally. Some left hidden writings describing the horror. Summary executions were also frequent, sometimes for alleged escape attempts, other times for unsubstantiated accusations. Hangings were organized in front of everyone. The bodies remained suspended for days. Inmates were forced to parade in front of them, watch, and remain silent. If anyone averted their gaze or showed emotion, they received immediate punishment. The intention was to normalize death, to make it part of the routine. The SS guards became increasingly brutal. Some were war veterans, others young, indoctrinated individuals. In both cases, cruelty was incentivized. Discipline, firmness, and lack of compassion were rewarded. Internal reports spoke of efficiency, order, and cleanliness, but what was happening was a daily massacre. No one could report anything. Everything remained internal. The Nazi organization had managed to turn crime into routine. Witnesses from this period describe Auschwitz as a place where time lost meaning. Days were all the same, faces changed, bodies piled up. The violence was so continuous that it was no longer distinguishable from daily tasks. It was not about individual punishments, but a generalized condition. Living in that environment was to be tortured non-stop, with every gesture, every silence, every blow, and every look. Attempts at resistance were almost impossible. Jews lacked means, support, and information. Some tried to sabotage minor tasks, hide food, or comfort others. But repression was immediate. Any suspicion ended in execution. Many simply retreated into their own silence to survive one more day. The Auschwitz system was efficient, mechanical, and ruthless. Tortures were part of every step. From the moment of arrival until the end, there was no truce. Every space, every routine, every rule was designed to dehumanize. Between 1942 and 1944, hundreds of thousands of Jews passed through these facilities. The vast majority did not leave alive. Those who survived did so bearing marks that never disappeared. This period marked the highest point of the Nazi torture system against the Jews. It was no longer about punishments for actions. It was existence itself that was punished. Every day was a condemnation, every hour a threat, every gesture a test of survival, and the end was always near, in the form of a gas chamber, a bullet, disease, or exhaustion. Pain was the norm. Death, the most common way out. From late 1944 to the first months of 1945, the camp system entered its final phase. The advance of the Red Army forced the Nazis to evacuate many of their extermination centers. This retreat was not orderly or precisely planned. It was chaotic, violent, and accelerated. As the Allies approached, the camps were forcibly emptied, and thousands of Jews were forced to march for tens of kilometers in the middle of winter. These marches are known as death marches. In them, hunger, cold, and shootings were constant. Those who fell were executed. Those who complained were also executed. In that last period, conditions in the camps that remained active deteriorated brutally. Food rations almost completely disappeared. Water was scarce, diseases spread uncontrollably, and lifeless bodies accumulated in every corner. There was no longer space to bury or move them. In the barracks, survivors shared bunks with the dead. Some inmates fed on scraps in the trash or on the leather of their boiled shoes. Surveillance relaxed at certain points, but this did not mean less violence. On the contrary, the guards acted without rules. Executions were improvised. Prisoners were beaten without reason, used as objects of discharge, or killed out of pure whim. Some were locked in sealed barracks without food or escape, and left to die slowly. Others were locked in pits and doused with gasoline. The ways of killing no longer responded to a system, but to a total void of control. During the evacuation marches, many Jews were forced to walk for weeks, without adequate clothing, without food, under sub-zero temperatures. Each stop was a torture in itself. Quick inspections were made, stragglers were executed, and the sick were left behind. Some were used as human shields, others as ammunition or weapon carriers. Those who tried to escape were shot immediately. The routes were marked by bodies abandoned in the snow. At some points, the guards forced the prisoners to dig their own graves before being shot. In others, entire groups were locked in barns or warehouses and set on fire. Those who managed to survive the flames were shot. Witnesses who lived through that period describe scenes of absolute horror without any kind of logic or justification. The cruelty was total. The only objective was to eliminate as many Jews as possible before the liberators arrived. As Soviet troops liberated the first camps, they encountered indescribable scenes: piled bodies, open mass graves, barracks infested with diseases, and a handful of barely conscious survivors. Many could not speak. Others only repeated the names of their relatives. In those final days, some guards escaped, but others remained and continued torturing until the last moment. There were cases where, despite knowing that the war was lost, officers decided to execute the remaining prisoners as a preventive measure. The destruction of evidence was also part of this phase. Orders were given to dynamite crematoria, burn documents, destroy archives, and eliminate all traces of what had happened. In Auschwitz, for example, attempts were made to dismantle the gas chambers. Lists were eliminated, photos were burned, and witnesses were murdered. The haste to erase evidence showed that they knew they had crossed all limits, but it was too late. There were too many remains, too many witnesses, too many traces. Some prisoners managed to hide documents, write testimonies, and conceal them underground or in walls. Many of these accounts were found after the war. Others left letters, drawings, or marks carved in the wood. Each was an attempt to leave a record, to tell what had been lived. In the final days, there were those who knew they would not come out alive, but wanted to leave at least a phrase, a date, a name. The few who survived those marches or the camps until the last day did so with their bodies and minds completely destroyed. The weight of what they lived never left them. The tortures of that final stage were no less cruel. They were just more desperate. They no longer responded to a structure, but to a mixture of hatred, fear, and abandonment. There was no search for efficiency, but direct harm. There was no discipline, only sadism. In some cases, the guards disguised themselves as prisoners to escape. Others surrendered, claiming due obedience. But the marks remained on the inmates. Scars, broken bones, mutilations, advanced infections. Many could not walk or fend for themselves. The pain had been so continuous that it had become part of existence itself. To live was to suffer, to survive an extended punishment. In the liberated camps, Allied medical teams tried to care for the prisoners. Many died in the first few days from acute malnutrition or untreated infections. Others couldn't bear the sudden change and collapsed mentally. It wasn't just about healing the body, but about confronting the internal destruction caused by years of continuous torture. There were no words enough to describe what had been lived. Some tried to tell their stories, others preferred silence. The Nazi torture system reached its limit in those final months. Every action, every punishment, every death reflected the collapse of a machine that no longer functioned as an institution, but as an uncontrolled accumulation of hatred. The Jews were the main victims, and the forms of harm reached unprecedented levels. There were no protocols, only direct violence, and although the system was falling, the tortures did not stop until the very last day. What remained were nameless bodies, smoking ruins, burned documents, and a few voices that managed to get out. Torture as a tool of government, of control, of extermination. A practice applied without pause for more than a decade. In those final months, pain was no longer a means. It was the end in itself. A way to close with blood a system that had been built from the beginning on the suffering of others. Throughout these years, the camp system showed how far an organized structure can go when violence becomes the norm. It was not just the number of people affected, but the way each punishment, each process, each order was designed to maintain a constant cycle of suffering. What happened was not limited to one place or one moment. It was a sustained mechanism, executed by thousands of hands and supported by a logic that needed no justification. The tortures that were applied did not arise by accident or by an excess of individual power, but as part of a general operation that converted physical and mental harm into a daily tool. That machinery operated for years without interruption, leaving an indelible mark, not only on the bodies of the victims, but in the memory of those who once saw it up close and could not forget it.